and not tainted by culture, you can then steer the child in whatever direction you wish the child to go. The second is that truth is discoverable, and that children can teach us something about the world that we no longer see. So children are actually, like in the old tale of the Emperor's New Clothes, children are uniquely positioned to speak truth to power. And so children are very kind of a convenient way of speaking truths that may not otherwise be able to be expressed, because they're conceived as having that special relationship to truth. And lastly, there's I think a built-in kind of tension that on the one hand children are conceived as pure and innocent, but on the other hand they're constantly, you need to engineer them and push them in this and that direction. So these two things are actually, I believe, a little bit in tension. And I also in the book talk about how this child-nature kind of bond is tainted by nostalgia. In other words, nostalgia here speaks to a lost innocence or a sense of lost time, a sense in which writing for children is about capturing some kind of eternal moment. But this is not a backward-looking impulse. This is not about writers writing about a childhood that they once lost. But nostalgia, when I talk about this here, is about writing about a future. It allows the imagining of a future at a time when the future is being increasingly foreclosed, as Janet Poole writes in her recent book. So as the future is disappearing, a curtain is dropping on Korean culture and language, but you have children's literature all along, because you have children all the time. And so someone is thinking that there is a future, and that we have to think about our children and write for them and imagine their future as well. So in addition to making children visible in society and producing visual material to suit child audiences, the leftist writers in the 1920s, the late 1920s, also took a great interest in the revolutionary potential for children's literature. Korea's proletarian writers presented their own political and social agendas in the pages of their dedicated children's magazines. With their own vested interest in shaping the affective world of the young, these leftist writers saw children as particularly valuable for the kind of privileged access to truth that they inherently possessed. Leftist writers were very interested in children's bodies and minds. They wanted to represent working class children's experiences, not just the bourgeois children that show up in the pages of Orini. They wanted to talk about the children in the factories, the ones working on the farms, the ones babysitting their siblings so that their parents could work. So to these proletariat writers, the Dongshim, the child heart, could be transformed through fiction into a natural ability to see inequality, to demand justice, and to rebel. So the truth that they saw was a moral truth. And to make this truth apparent, leftist writers turned to the bodies of children and turned them into the main sites of awakening. And emotion was used for the purposes of political mobilization. So for example, here is a poem by Lee Dong-gyu, and it reads as follows. Walgang dalgang, plant the hemp, spend all summer making it grow. After autumn, cut it down. Finally, have a nice full gut. Take it to the landowner's house. Pay back your dues at the supervisor's house. A handful here, a handful there, and all that's left is barely chaff. Should we boil it in this pot? Should we boil it in that pot? Or should we throw it at the greedy landowner and tell him to polish that off too? So there's a rhythmic structure in this poem. 왈강 달강 배를 심어 여름 동안 길러내어. That's how it starts. And it's almost like a military pace of the poem that's driven by this momentum that cannot be stopped. It starts with a planting and ends with this proposal to throw the leftovers in the landowner's face. You don't see these kinds of poems in the early stages of children's literature in the 1920s. But by the 1930s, leftist writers have gotten very bold and very explicit in their desire to use literature for young readers as a site of political and social awakening. Following the disbandment of leftist organizations in the mid-1930s, writers of leftist sympathies contributed to children's magazines that were published even in the most oppressive period of the late 1930s and early 1940s. As war swept over Asia and Japan militarized the peninsula, children became ever more implicated in the imperialist culture of late colonial Korea. Magazines like Sonyeon, this is a later Sonyeon that was published between 1937 and 1940, were venues in which images and text made military culture a natural part of child play. This may be unsurprising given the historical context in this period. But what is surprising here is that in the same venue, the pro-Japanese magazines also hosted sections like the one on the left, which is part of something that was called kalkaltewe, jokes. Every month there were, jokes in the back of this magazine, which poked fun at figures of authority. Much of the humor is generated by these figures acting out of character, and the more authoritative they were, police officers, elders, teachers, the greater the fun and the joy that's expressed in these moments of misrecognition. So for example, in this joke, the policeman says, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" And the blind man says, "Oh, cut it out, stop pretending, I can tell you're not a real officer." So here, the blind man's handicap allows him the freedom to challenge, to make fun of, to dismiss this official, which actually, as we see from the illustration, it really is a policeman. So I found in this magazine, this was one of the more interesting or one of the parts I got really excited about, is that when I was looking at this these late colonial magazines, and again, when I say late colonial, I'm talking about the period where Japan is militarized, is already has engaged in war with China, and is drafting soldiers into the army. And it's really what we refer to as the most oppressive part of the colonial period for Koreans, where they have to go to Shinto shrines and they have to change their names. And yet you have these magazines that are in Korean, and some of them, as we see, are very kind of militaristic, and they celebrate the military culture and soldiers as child's play. But at the same time, we also have these jokes that make fun. And we also have short fiction that is written by a lot of the leftist writers. So these divisions between left and right were really a lot less demarcated. They were a lot more blurry in the pages of these magazines. So whether on the left or the right of the political spectrum, writers contended with this idea of the child heart as natural and outside culture. Even upon liberation in 1945, the idea of the child heart, which was now imbued with a national consciousness or identity, was a fruitful and productive way of accessing the interiority of the child. The national child heart was tenaciously embraced and mobilized, even while it was interpreted in widely different ways. The child heart underwent an important qualitative change with the defeat of the Japanese, the division of North and South Korea, and the ensuing Korean War. While children's writers appealed to the authority of science through the colonial period as the best method through which to understand the physical world, they also at times viewed science with suspicion as interfering with the child heart. But this changed with the dropping of the atomic bombs, the utter devastation of the peninsula during the Korean War, and the new world order into which North and South Korea came into being. Until the 1950s, the child heart's qualities had been maintained and fortified through the coupling of child and nature. But in the atomic age, the child heart experienced a shift. Dongxing was still important, but rather than promoting the idea of a natural child on the threshold of culture, children's magazines from the post-war period indicate that the child was to be the main agent of the transformation of nature. The fictional children of post-war children's literature recognized nature's inherent flaws and set out to master the universe through acts that ranged from raising the bottom of the ocean floor and exploring and colonizing other planets. The child heart that had been defined by its privileged communication with nature, that granted children a pristine goodness and deep wisdom, was now put to a new purpose. To continue to maintain a privileged view of the world, the child's final mission was to become nature's master. So from the very start, it was the privileged relationship with nature that was the very essence of the child heart. Children's perceived affinity with nature's elements and creatures kept them always on the threshold of culture, always part of it, but not quite. The idea of a natural child, natural in body and in heart, represented by the term 동심, sustained decades of texts and images for children and allowed writers the opportunity to meditate on the artifice of culture, as well as to access a range of transcendent truths. But it is also the relationship between child and nature that underwent the most radical transformation with the rise of the nuclear age, known also as the age of the loss of innocence. And that spelled the advent of a new relationship between child and nature that continues to this day. My book, in conclusion, engages with children's literature from Korea's colonial period in a manner that aims to broaden our understanding of how this literature might enrich the conversation about colonial modernity. It seeks to do so by approaching children's literature as a site that simultaneously engaged with, resisted, and built on discourses arising from the colonial situation. Literature for children is central to understanding the interaction of the national, the colonial, and the modern, because so much rested on the shoulders of the next generation who had to be inducted into the world through text and image. The task of understanding why children mattered in an era that is becoming more distant by the day is difficult for several reasons. An obvious difficulty is that many of the men and women who lived out their childhoods in the colonial period are no longer with us, or their memories have since been clouded by post-war ideological discourses that the details of their everyday lives have been obscured. But we have texts, and Seth Lehrer reminds us that the child was made through texts and tales that he or she studied, heard, and told back, and that books are taken into childhood, foster social communication, and in their interaction with their readers, owners, sellers, and collectors, teach and please. And it's so it is by accessing literature written for children that I hope to reveal why children mattered for writers and intellectuals, what freedoms and possibilities writing for children opened up, and what dreams and visions children's literature enabled in the transition from colonial to post-colonial Korea. So as I promised, in the few remaining minutes, I want to share with you some recent research that has emerged from that last chapter. And this is material that's coming out in September in a journal article, and hopefully, as I said, will be expanded into a new book project. So my interest in science and literature came out of this intimate connection that my first book tried to explore between child and nature. So when I came across these North Korean magazines in the Library of Congress, I started to think about how the relationship between child and nature, or here more accurately, youth and nature, changed in the context of the Cold War. Existing scholarship on the field of science in North Korea of the 50s and 60s, which is when these magazines were published, helped me understand how important science was to the development of North Korea. Right now I'm going to be talking only about North Korea. There's a South Korean component to my book, but I haven't written it yet, so I'm really going to focus on North Korea for the rest of my talk. But what I found so interesting was the ideological, and more importantly, the moral tone that framed what I thought would be pretty straightforward science. So when I found these science magazines in the Library of Congress, at first I was really scared to open them because I thought, the last time I did science was probably middle school. No, I did some in high school. But I was sure that I wasn't going to be able to understand a word of it. And I also thought, what would a person like me who studies texts and has an interest in literature, loves literature, what would I find in these science magazines? But they were fascinating. And I'll talk a little bit now about what I am doing with science magazines as a person who does literature. And again, my focus is really, for the remainder of this talk, is about ideology, but more specifically the idea of the moral. It shouldn't surprise any of us that science and technology is framed by ideology, right? We know that ideology, that technology was invested with ideological meaning throughout 20th century Japan. Mao's massive projects led by this, the idea of man must conquer nature. Stalin was interested in biology, linguistics, physiology, as symbolic weapons of the Soviet Union and the ideological front against the West. But there was one quote from a book published in 1955 about the history of post-liberation development in North Korea, which really caught my eye, and I'm going to read it. Our education must arm the next generation with a scientific worldview, 과학적 세계관, and cultivate these through refined moral values, 고상한 도덕적 충성, and cultured actions, 문화적 행동, and in this way raise a patriotic people who will fight for the development of society. The remaining tasks for our liberated land include rebuilding and expanding the work of education, cultivating and expanding the number of technicians, improving educational content, and quickly developing our culture and science. So, from this long quote, we see education, science, and culture, but also refined morals. I thought, what is this word refined moral values doing here? How do you reconcile that with, this word 고상한 was just so, I couldn't figure out what to do with this word. It's so abstract, it doesn't seem to fit. Right? This idea of like a refined or noble. And so I became drawn to this question of science and literature, and more specifically science and narrative. And these magazines that I showed you earlier gave me an opportunity to think about how language and its organization in narrative provides ideological and moral shape to science. So in my article, I argue that moral landscaping of youth, the landscaping of the moral space, was seen as vital to North Korea's future, and that science and general interest magazines were useful tools for teaching morality and restructuring two important relationships in moral terms, youth and nature, and youth and community. Second, I argue that the moment that science moves through language and is organized in textual and visual narrative is the moment that science becomes both rhetorically potent and potentially volatile. And third and last, I argue that the potential volatility of science was most exposed in the realm of the youthful mind or fantasy, and it was therefore the most elusive and in most urgent need of restructuring. So just to give you a sense of the materials, I'm sorry, this is so small, it's so hard for you to see, and it's delightful, so I'll just describe this a little bit to you. So this is one of the materials that I was looking at to try and understand how morality enters these young reader or youth magazines. And there's this really interesting section that started to appear in a magazine called 세세대, New Generation, that was titled Binocular Corps, right? 낭원경 부대. And here, what I found really interesting is that you have this sort of, the relationship between youth and nature and youth and environment and youth and community is really spelled out in moral terms. So on the left-hand side, you have the positive behavior, and on the right-hand side, you have the negative behavior. And so, for example, if you go from the top, the title of the top is 우리 것을 귀중히 하자, right? Let's respect that which belongs to all of us, right? Do not treat these belongings or these objects as your own personal property. So you have on the right-hand side, you have these boys sitting on their desks with their legs spread apart, and they're, looking like they're engaged in some kind of private game. And then on the right-hand side, on the left, is the good behavior where they're all working together to clean. Here we have, here you're supposed to walk on the left-hand side, so obey the directions of walking, because if you don't, then you could crash into this really nice 할머니 that's carrying her bag or her jackie. And then on the bottom, it says, your desks are not parallel bars. So yes, you should all be doing your calisthenics and do your gymnastic exercises, but your desks that's not what the desks are for. So what's really interesting is, first of all, that that you have these kind of sections that are trying to control or explain how you should relate to your environment. But I also love the way that the illustrations, and again, to do a little bit of visual kind of analysis, I'm not an art historian, unfortunately, but if you look at the way that the visual space is organized, the left, the good behavior is kind of, you have all these straight lines, and everything is kind of harmonic, and then on the right-hand side, you have these diagonals and these squiggly lines, and the physical space itself is disrupted, in kind of really emphasizing the bad behavior. And believe me, some of these sections, I had a really hard time understanding what was good and what was bad. It was so, some of them were more difficult to understand. Another text that I use to talk about this relationship between language, narrative, and science is this idea of linearity. So I'll explain what I mean. The way that this text here is spelled out, it's laid out with a beginning, middle, and end. In this case, in panels. And that imposes a structure that mimics the logic of scientific method of observation, measurement, and experiment. So in this case, for example, the purpose of this cartoon, right, this is Myung-Eun's rocket, the rocket made by Myung-Eun. So the purpose of this cartoon is to explain a formula that's down here, to show that, how to make combustion, how it works. But what I really found interesting here is that what we're getting here is a story of scientific inquiry and how it emerges. So you have the boy who is coming out of a library, 도서관 right there, and he has an idea. He's very excited. So you see immediately that it's about the sort of self-propelled, self-motivated study and curiosity. And he's checking his book to see, to follow up on this idea. He tells his friend, in panel 4, they go, yes, that's exactly what we learned in class. And then he's going to run home and do it himself in the living room. And so, he studies it, he makes sure he has all the right equipment. His friend is kind of looking along, going, what are you doing, boy, right? And then they put together this thing, lickety-split, and set it off. And quang, there you have the rocket goes, it's successful. And that all goes to illustrate this, the efficacy of this scientific formula. So the form of the cartoon, the numbered panels that share space on the page, they only make sense if you read them in the proper order. They mimic the content, which illustrates how curiosity, academic diligence, optimism, and confidence in the scientific principles can lead to only one result. And finally, this is the last part of my article and my talk, I talk about fantasy, or 공상. So fantasy is the final frontier, by which I mean that fantasy or imagination was crucial to bring about the kind of changes to society that were necessary. But as I said, it was also viewed as the most volatile of spaces. Right? You had to get into the minds of youth, to that pre-linguistic space, and make sure that the right kind of fantasy was taking place. One that anticipated the workers' revolution, the commitment to the community, and a broadly inclusive vision of development. So in this next project, I hope to continue to think about morals, about ethics, and the way that language structures science, and also about this idea of imagination that was so important both in North Korea and in South Korea. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.